That's kind of conversation between the soul. That's conversation between the soul and the mind.
Hello, Prestige heads, and welcome to American Prestige. I'm Danny Bessner, here as always with my friend and comrade Derek Davison, and we're very excited to welcome to the podcast today Katrina vanden Heuvel. Katrina is someone who's written about many different things over the years, but she is a publisher at The Nation, and we've invited her to talk about a bunch of different topics: Trump publishing as a left-wing magazine, Ukraine, war, and all of those good things. But first thing, Katrina, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's heard a lot about the program and how stimulating it is. I won't speak for today, but
all good, I hope. So why don't we start with just the first question, which is we're writing about it almost a week after Liberation Day, where Trump's tariffs have totally reformed the American economy. And whatever you have to say about Donald Trump, he is definitely doing something new. I was talking to someone earlier today. I cannot imagine anyone who even approached the presidency doing something this wild. So that's interesting. But Katrina, I was just wondering, what is your take on Donald Trump? What do you see as the differences between Trump 1 and Trump 2? And what do you think is actually going on here? Is this just some grift? Is Trump actually trying to reform the American economy in a different way? So any way you want to take that conversation, please do so.
We could even do like a real-time stock tracker as we're recording this.
Things aren't going so well.
Be a fascinating artifact.
Time has been weaponized. I mean, I remember sitting down at The Nation and thinking through a 100-day package, which is the ritual, conventional approach to the presidency. And that just ended at the end of that day because we saw that things were moving at nanosecond speed. I think it was a mistake for those who didn't believe Project 2025 was a real blueprint. We did a special issue on it. Kim Phillips-Fine, great historian, looked at how much harsher, more direct, frontally direct an attack on a system's culture Project 2025 was than the Heritage Foundation mandate for leadership. If you remember that, your listeners, it was the Reagan mandate done by the Heritage Foundation, which was much more within an establishment conservative right-wing framework. You know, you ask a question that many Europeans ask, and I say that because I did a research trip, don't laugh, to London, Paris, and Berlin about a week ago. And as you travel from London to Berlin, the right wing becomes more and more ascendant in the polls in those countries, and they want to know what Trump is about. Of course, they're still whiplashed from J.D. Vance's brilliant oration at the Munich Security Conference. But, you know, Trump is the most virulent, most full-fledged bad American actor in a time of systems, anti-traditional party. The center parties, the systems parties, are collapsing in Europe, and the right is ascendant. And so you need to look at some of, it seems to me, the structural reasons. And Trump has a plan, and he has people ready to fulfill that plan. And it was not the case from the first term. There's a danger because in having a term away from the White House, there was a chance in the, quote, wilderness to build a set of ideas and build people in who are, quote, loyal. So tariffs, you know, he's doing what he said he was going to do. I mean, you have people in the room with him in these last days, not just Musk, but Peter Navarro, who's his trade rep. I mean, you know, this is something Peter Navarro has been fighting for decades, and he's being listened to. I think there will be some schisms, and not just what we're seeing or hoping with the Musk-Trump schism, but you got a lot of Wall Street guys who he's appointed, whose first loyalty may be to Wall Street or maybe to Trump and Wall Street. So you could see some schisms. But this is not isolated, what we're witnessing with the rise of, quote, I hate to call it populist right. It's a populist extremist right. And that, I think, explains a lot about Trump. What confounds me, I mean, there are people, we had a great writer, William Greider, who wrote the best book on the Fed, Secrets of the Temple, I think. And he was a real, like, who will tell the people? He was a real populist. He understood the value of tariffs, but you got to do targeted tariffs with an industrial policy and sectoral, and that's not what's going on here. So he takes these ideas that have merit, Trump does, blows them up, spits them out, deforms them, makes them tough to say, well, I'm for tariffs in different ways. And people say, you're a Trumpian. Or you say, I'm really for finding a way to avoid rearming Europe. And they'll say, you're a Putin puppet. So he's become difficult as a messenger for certain ideas which have had credence in a kind of populist framework. So it's as someone said it on the trip, it's like Alice in Wonderland time. It's scrambled times. You know this. You see it every day. And it's complicated.
It really feels like a presidency that knows it's got 2 years basically to get anything done and has resigned itself to losing Congress in the midterm. You know, for all his talk about how he's going to somehow get a third term, like I think there's a recognition that that's probably not going to happen, and they'll be left with like J.D. Vance running at the top of the ticket. And so the chances of actually turning this into a long-term project are maybe slim, and they're pulling out all the stops. Like this would not, I think, and it's not just a question of personnel, it's a question of mindset. I don't think they would have done this. Could they go back into the first term and like with hindsight, even then, I don't think like they would have done it because there wasn't, some hope that you could extend this out to an 8-year project. But now it feels like we've just got to cram everything into these 2 years. To your point about time being weaponized, it's just like we're in a race to get as much of this stuff done as we possibly can.
And he's a grievance actor, Trump. And so he's taking revenge to some extent for what happened in the first term. He wasn't prepared. You don't bring in John Bolton if you are serious about an agenda of ideology and linear. So he brought in people who he thought were frenemies, and the idea of bring people closer, but they turned on him, wrote memoirs. And of course, the Russiagate 4 or 5 years, I think, was a waste of time for ignoring our own country's homegrown problems.
Agreed. Yeah.
But he saw in that characters who were ready to get him, whether in the FBI or justice. So he's playing that out too.
I actually think leads directly into my question, because one of the historical questions is what explains the extreme radicalization. So on one hand, he's older and he's angrier. On the other hand, there has definitely been the formation of coalitions around Trump that are more able to use the state in a meaningful way. There's been an ideological transformation where someone like J.D. Vance could go from calling Trump Hitler to to being his vice president. But I want to talk about us on the left and the center left here, because I do think that there was a gigantic strategic mistake, which was instead of letting him sort of wither after the loss of the first election, which is trying to basically use the law to go after him in a way that has, I would say, profoundly backfired. I think that is, for someone who's such a personalist in terms of his politics, for someone who's so grievance-driven, for someone who, as that movie showed, came up through Roy Cohn, one of the most grievance-driven people in human history, that you couldn't come after him and miss. And to borrow a phrase from The Wire, they came at the king and they missed, and they missed really badly. And so I was just wondering, thinking about resistance to Trump, how does that play into how you think about this? Or like, was that a failure? Should we have done something differently?
Well, I think
what do you think about that?
This is something I saw in Europe too, because I wasn't there when Le Pen. I love the real life nature of this. It's really good. It's a reality show. Behind you. No, but more seriously, this is being raised with Le Pen too. Do you, or with AfD, there's a big debate about the right-wing party in Germany. Do you ban it or do you permit it on the ballot? If you ban it, it's suppressed. It goes underground. It's a big decision. I do think the liberal center left has made a mistake in using lawfare as opposed to politics, leading with politics. I'm not ignoring lawfare where it's legitimate, but you want to defeat. You don't want to legalize or And I think particularly with a grievance-driven creature like Trump, he's going after the lawyers, the law firms who supported the drive against him. This is an issue, and it's people are pleased that the courts have shown some buffer of resistance. I fear it's not going to be sustained. I think we got to focus on the midterm, as you suggested, and local state races. But it's I think we were at the Nation watching election night. The loss of the House was a real blow. And I think that's where the focus will be moving forward. But that's short term. because I think the center is not holding well. And it's, this idea of the old order is dying, the new one's not yet born, has a real feel to it of reality.
So that to me is the other big question, because my mind, I do think that Trump's success is, of course, partially due to Trump and the emergence of a powerful far right movement. But on balance, I would say it has mostly to do with the failure of liberalism, or if you don't want to use the term liberalism as an ideology, the failure of the Democratic Party, which for a variety of reasons has become so associated with professional managerialism that people just hate the party.
So I have a problem not just because I've returned. Sounds terrible. I returned from a continent of parliamentary parties. The Democratic Party is one party, and within it you have factions. I mean, someone once said, a great writer, I think it was Ilya Ehrenberg, the Russian writer, that, within the Communist Party, you have one party. They had one party, and out of it emerged Gorbachev, right-wing communists, nationalists. So in this country, the Progressive Caucus is the largest caucus in the House. It's run by people, many of whom have written for the nation, who have good values. Bernie Sanders founded the Progressive Caucus some 20 years ago when he was in the Congress. So I think the Democratic Party establishment has self-corroded. I think we have to go back to the old-fashioned principles. Look, we just came out of a $1 billion state Supreme Court race. Bernie Sanders, one of the great things he did was try to do small money. There's a reason that the Democratic Party is divided, because it's had the socially, culturally liberal forces. Bob Rubin, right? For choice, great. For climate. But when it came to economic issues, providing for those who needed to see their lives improved by politics, there's been such kind of, it's just the transfer of wealth, the corruption of the establishment. These are things people see. Bernie was doing well. Bernie's changed the valence, not to be overly Bernie, but he really has changed the valence.
We are very overly Bernie. Totally fine.
So I just think there's at the nation, people say the Democratic Party's failed. And I say you got to look a little more closely, because if you self-marginalize, like, you're not producing a forward motion. Yes, be critical minded. And I always believe in exposing, but I also believe in proposing. What's the alternative? Because you leave people without sense of alternative, contributes to more despair.
There is this move, though. I mean, I'm curious what you make of, like, in the wake of the election, there's been this move to resuscitate third way democratic politics, and what jogged my thought about this is you mentioned Bernie, bringing about the idea of the small dollar mass donation. This is one of the things that they're explicitly arguing to do away with. The tyranny of these small dollar donors is destroying the Democratic Party. It's just absurd to me. And yet this seems to be, the path that a lot of people want to go down.
The narrative is wrong. I mean, you come out of these elections and you always have something like a third way, which is going to preach moderation and blame. I mean, I would lead with bread and butter issues. I mean, I wrote a column 2 years ago that Biden should give every family a hearing aid and sign it from Biden. I mean, that's how simplistic, but not simplistic I was. I wouldn't lead with woke. I would lead with an economic populism that could be broader in multiracial ways, of course. But I do think I was invited to an establishment Democratic event this coming week in New York. Of course, James Carville's involved. But the keynote speaker at the end, keynote speaker, is Liz Cheney. I mean, okay, maybe you needed a popular front in the Kamala race. But now, I mean, it just seemed to me kind of, this is what happens when you get tethered. You don't drop the burden, you continue with it. And in that sense, the center parties, I think, are going to be disrupted by voters who don't seek that. All right, so I'm excited that you have a new generation that has gone into politics, because at the nation 20 years ago, it was inside, outside. You were inside or you were outside. And I do think there are people inside who are allies. And you need that in terms of movement energy into political inside. And not Chuck Schumer, but there are people contesting. I mean, there's a woman running against Jan Schakowsky, who's been a congressperson for 25 years. I feel so old because I remember when she was a mother in a grocery store and found spoiled milk, and it led her like a love canal to go after the bosses. And the intern at The Nation who's writing a piece about her opponent had never heard of Jen Schakowsky, or that she had the most progressive healthcare staffer in the Congress. It's just a little history, not to say don't give attention to those who are challenging an old generation. But I did see something yesterday about young people challenging an older generation. It's not just because I feel old, but Bernie's 82. Bernie, come on, give me Bernie over the third wave 22-year-old.
82 years young. So one thing, I mean, you might be shocked to hear, Katrina, but Derek and I don't have the strongest connections to the Democratic Party donor class. But how are the donors reacting to this? How are the people who are going to have to? I think there's going to be no change unless you have the people who are giving money to the party actually demand change, which has been historically true in this country since at least the 1970s, if not even a bit earlier. How are the donors that you come in contact with understanding what is happening, framing the rise of Trump too?
So there are progressive donors like Way to Win, Leah Hunt Hendricks, people in a certain place who want to fund progressive, outside the box elections. The more centrist establishment Democrats don't really know, but I think they very much want to erase 2024 and head forward in 28 with similar policies. And I think that's going to be really dangerous, that there's not enough rethinking in the party about, it's not, you just don't travel to Owensboro, Kentucky and say, I'm, a populist. You got to find ways to express that in how people's lives are improved. We've talked tariff, but we're heading into this tax bill. I mean, this is brutal. They want to expand and freeze. And the investment in people's lives doesn't just come from talking. So I do think the party, the lead donor party, is going to try to just Band-Aid up and not do a real autopsy.
So is that just because wealthy people don't want to give up their money, and this is something that we're just going to come up with a brick wall again and again and again? That ultimately, if the actual move is going to need to be some genuine form of economic redistribution on a massive scale, equivalent to the 30s to the 60s, and that just the people who have now vote Democrat, it's the old critique, it's just two sides of the party of capital. And that, to me, it emerges in my own space because, Derek and I are a lefty indie media thing. You have a various lefty indie media podcasts, and we have never been approached by a left-wing donor in order to go bigger, right? Where this is something that happens constantly on the right wing.
Part of
people
what's
are
happened,
astroturfed. Yeah, please.
Part of what's happened on the left progressive donor side is I don't think they understand the importance of media. The right wing does. But the funding that exists doesn't understand the need to have a narrative, have a regular voice in the media. Now, that's not the case in certain arenas. And we are seeing the development of alternatives to the gatekeepers as they existed. I think it's a really interesting moment. But, the gatekeepers are not just the New York Times. It's just we've seen the media, corporate and some others, do an anticipatory bend on the knee because they're fearful that because they're in a corporate structure, they got business in Washington in front of regulatory agencies. We did a chart in 1996, our first centerfold, called the National Entertainment State, and the cogs of news inside these huge, GE, Bertelsmann, News Corp, Disney. So that's a problem which relates to money. I do think there are other ways around the money issue, incredible mobilization, but it probably is more local and state, federal, and national races. But there was a lot of energy around money and politics and independent media and politics in the 90s and early 2000. And I think we've got to make it an issue instead of engaging in the arms race, which, the Democrats have put up big money. And you do see the limits of it in terms of any change in the tax system and other things.
Yeah, there was Air America.
On the other hand, you do have DSA in New York is very interesting because they're inside the state assembly and the state senate. We've had the mayoral candidates come through the nation. So Brad Lander, Stringer, Zoran Mamdani, we're having Jessica Ramos, Zelnor Myrie. Zoran Mamdani is making socialism look hip. And I don't laugh at that, but I do, because it's not about style, and it's certainly not AOC at the Met dinner with her dress, which, that kind of stuff. But Zoran's serious, and he leads with tenant evictions, free bus, housing, safe housing. And I think seeing that kind of bread and butter work from a reviving DSA, it's not the answer, but it's interesting. And there are DSA chapters around the country, specifically in Chicago, and there's a media.
Yeah, and this is where I go back to.
I think I'm kind of at this moment sort of let 20 flowers bloom, in the sense that, like people will say Code Pink, well, they're doing their thing. Or people will say J Street, in fact, The Nation, but they're based in Washington, and it's not Jewish Voice for Peace. You have a different, and Indivisible, which wasn't the most radical by any measure, has played a good role in the last few weeks, giving people a sense of where to go to at least show they're present at this time.
Yeah, the way that I think about it is I go back to the 20s, where there was a real social democratic life world, where you had your bowling leagues, you had your DSA equivalent, you had your media organizations. And I think if anything, because I just think this is a time for rebuilding, I don't think that the Democratic Party, I don't think Schumer's on the way out in the next 2 years necessarily. But I think that,
but it's up to us in a way.
Yeah, well, it's up to
us to kind of.
Yeah, I think it's up to everyone in the coalition. We need our version of the Daily Wire. We need our version that's going to be funded. We need our Zorans. We need our DSAs, and these all need to be part of a coherent structure. But for some reason, the left and the left liberal side, I would include, seems incapable of doing it. We have the Times, but the Times, obviously, everyone on this call has a very significant, I'm sure, disagreements with it. But we have this life world that is just not being created. And if we don't create the life world, all the kids who are online are just going to go to Joe Rogan, an extraordinary right-wing psychopathy, which is where they're going, because there's just there's no money behind the left, and there's no real organizational structure behind the left. And to me, that's a gigantic problem if we want to win the next generation. But Derek, I know you had a question.
So we want to devote more attention to this, because we had Tom Hartman. Again, he's not. There is also, you need a charisma on talk radio, and you need some coalitions, and a lot of the talk radio, by the way, is religious in parts of this country, and that has a big network. I want to come back to what you said about networks, bowling alleys and clubs. And it's true that in the 20s, 30s, and into the 50s, you had labor halls. You also had American Legion halls. You had Rotary clubs, which are still active. And I think there is this kind of loneliness that is a cliche, but is real, that is imbued by time spent in front of a screen. I think Occupy was interesting many years ago because people talked to each other and sat in circles or around the country. And I think all those movements have been important to bring people together. But we find new ways to come together. And I thought yesterday was one. Demonstrations are often treated as, but people come together, they see others are coming, there's a solidarity, there's possibly radicalization, there's introduction to other issues because you're with others. But I hear you, it's a very tough time, and the right does seem to have some energy in the media landscape, and some of that is fueled by money. Not all. It's talent, it's characters too.
To that point, to sort of continue this on this line, I guess I'm curious, when you see the critique that is emerging among a lot of Democrats or Democratic Party adjacent folks about the mainstream media, meaning, the New York Times, the Washington Post, et cetera, et cetera. There seems to be a frustration that the New York Times isn't constantly making the case against Donald Trump so that Democrats don't have to, or so. It's a very strange phenomenon to me. A lot of the complaints that I see, and some of this, it comes from a place again of money. It comes from Jeff Bezos owning the Washington Post and genuflecting to Donald Trump, which I get, or the guy who owns the LA Times, bending the knee to Trump. I get that, But there also seems to be this just kind of embittered reaction that, like, you want us to do politics? The New York Times should be doing the politics for us. That strikes me as just very ineffectual, even in terms of dealing with the type of media that you would think a lot of these people would be very familiar with.
That's interesting. I mean, the New York Times is really, I mean, you got 3 papers. The Post, I get the hard copy, and was so slim yesterday and today. But the Times is, there. But the Washington Post for 4 or 5 years had it easy. It coasted as the resistance paper. The democracy dies in darkness, right? Because Trump was such an affront to their liberalism, their mainstream liberalism, which is what these papers are to a large extent, except they have columnists like Max Boot, that are not.
I never heard that one, and I've been a Max Boot hater for 20 years.
The only more favorite one, Molly Ivins years ago said that Pat Buchanan's speech at the 1992 convention, you may have heard this, was better in the original German. All right, put that aside.
No, that is I've heard that. Yeah,
they have very right-wing op-ed page, which I wrote for online mostly for 7 years and wasn't bothered when I wrote about Amazon. So that's changed in interesting ways. But Trump is such an affront to this kind of liberalism. You see it in the tariffs. The establishment economics is Wall Street. And Wall Street establishment is pissed off. So you're getting a lot more tariff coverage and a lot more anger around it that you might otherwise get. But they are mainstream liberal, and they too are suffering from the center. The New York Times would have been sold to the Mexican oligarch Carlos Slim 12 years ago, except it discovered Wordle, recipes, and all power. And that they're living on some of that. And if you look at the Times on the second page, it's a service. It's like how to do a tie, because they've acquired Wirecutter, how to cut something effective. And all these other papers want to expand like that. That's a politics of life and service. No, but I think people are creating new things. I mean, I think of the Substacks. I think of Twitter. I hate to say that, Bluesky, where you go and find people. We found Elie Mystal, our great editor, Lizzie Ratner, on Twitter when it was still Twitter. And so people are finding voices and writers. Now, maybe that's because that's our job, but still people find outside of the mainstream. Now, there's Gray Zone, and there's there's Glenn Greenwald, and you got a lot of voices on the, what would I say, the kind of libertarian, anti-surveillance, anti-elite.
Yeah, it's American. It doesn't line up with an ideology in the way it should.
Anti-elite
it's like this American
one way to
thing.
think of it, yeah.
Someone once said the ideology of America is that we don't have an ideology. I think it's a word. It's a big word.
It's correct. Yeah, it is correct. I'm writing something on this for Harper's right now, but it is correct. Ideology is not never has. It was strange that it became so central between the 40s and today. Usually wasn't in this country because it's too big, too federalist for ideology to really make sense.
But you mentioned the 20s. I mean, there's also Roosevelt. I mean, I think a lot of what we're witnessing is a rolling back of I'd say, civilizing advances of the 20th century. Roosevelt.
1,000%. That is what it is. Yes, agreed.
The Great Society, the bookends. And Roosevelt, he had a brilliant brain trust. Francis Perkins, others, Robert Wagner. But he saved capitalism from itself, in a sense. But there was an energy, a labor energy and other energies and other forces. But I do think rolling back the 20th century, there's an anti-modernity. There's a know-nothing kind of politics of a different era.
As you all know, my favorite national holiday is spring break. And this year, I'm treating myself to work with factories that use dishes. I really love their linen grades, 100U free prestige.
Year. And then my doctor next year
tongue loss can
these last couple of months, but I policy. So, Katrina, I'd like to take us in the direction of foreign policy a little bit more. This is, of course, a foreign policy oriented podcast, but I think one thing that's marked these last couple of months as we are into Trump 2.0 has been the U.S. relationship with Europe. And this encompasses the tariffs. It encompasses Trump's, Oval Office argument with Zelensky and, the struggle to kind of get the U.S. to support any sort of peacekeeping force if it might happen, the concerns about NATO, the concerns about the EU. As you are sort of watching this, and I know you're attuned to sort of the politics of Europe as well, what do you make of where things stand right now in the relationship, the transatlantic relationship?
I think it's a tragedy. I say that because Europe is now consumed with rearming. There's a new EU paper one of our writers is analyzing, but it's going to commit that continent and the UK to budgets that will deprive the countries of the possibility of real social programs or addressing the needs of their countries, which are real. And there's a freak out, about Trump. Someone in the trip to Europe I made said that everything changed the day of the Oval Office meeting with Zelensky. Like it was too much. On the other hand, today there's a story in the Times, a big story about how Europe rearming, and the narrative is that Putin is expansionist. This is animating the narrative. And there are different narratives from intelligent people that it's not about Russian expansion to the Baltics and Eastern Europe. It's about preserving a sphere of influence, argue it or not. But just to they showed how weak they were, the Russians did, in the invasion of Ukraine, not the strength. But you see a generation, and in Germany, Merz, who's the prime minister, and they're building coalitions. This was a huge thing in Germany. They broke the debt limit one time, not forever, but to put together about 600 billion or more in defense spending. They do have a pot for infrastructure and others, but it's not comparable, and it's unclear if it will be rated. So all I'm saying is, because of this narrative that a lot of people have bought into in Europe, you are going to see a generation of funding of armaments, which may not help their economies. It's not clear it's military Keynesianism, because they may need to buy from other countries. It's not necessarily true that their industries will be rehabilitated or revived.
So then this is, of course, the big question. So how does one navigate the tension between the U.S. empire and the United States clearly being in Europe, at least for part of reason to end a major war on the continent, with the fact that the U.S. empire has diverted so many resources at home? Because if you look at the Cold War, I would say the benefit of the Cold War really was in Europe, that this is really where it did the right thing. But was that dependent on the 20 million dead in Asia, who died due to Cold War era conflicts and basically the exportation of war from Europe to the Asian Rim, as Paul Thomas Chamberlain calls it. And so to me, like, you never want to just cut and run, which is what the United States has always done. And I think it's probably going to do that with Taiwan instead of doing a 20-year generational long shift. Yeah, instead of doing like a 20-year plan.
There is the so-called pivot to Asia, which partly explains
I think it's
why
fantasy,
Trump wants to move out of the Russia sphere, get a deal done, so they can pivot.
Precisely.
But the empire is
to me,
trouble. The empire is in trouble.
The empire is in trouble.
And in trouble, that can lead to countries wanting to... Europe sees what's going on here. They have their own right wing, which is, by the way, consistent with not wanting to send troops to... There's a Trumpian right foreign policy in Europe where the AfD doesn't want to send troops. Le Pen didn't want to. And Farage doesn't want to. And you can argue it's relations with Russia, or they just feel it's a bad policy. But the empire's in decline. Trump is blustering his way through that. And Americans, I've always felt that these projects are more elite than in the hearts of people. I mean, like in Wisconsin, Ohio, and Michigan in 2016, there were polls about how endless war and empire were very unpopular, partly because men were being shipped for multiple deployments to feed the empire. So it's a turbulent situation. The left, many of the left, certainly the Socialist Party in France, in Berlin, if you can believe it, Germany, Die Linke, the former East German Communist Party, which has become hip and is now in the parliament, is divided over sending weapons. Sending weapons to Ukraine is now a litmus test, but the rearmament of Europe is part of that. And I, again, think it's a tragedy. No one wants to cut and run, but, it's something others have talked about for years, not Trump, but Biden, others, Europe being more autonomous. It was very much about de Gaulle, who wanted France to be more independent, have an independent foreign policy. It's not the worst thing, but it's how it's happening that I think is destructive.
Right. So then what should the U.S. do, right? It's not the worst thing if you're looking at it from a 40,000-foot view, but just the cutting and ending it is not particularly good or particularly
useful. No one's going to cut and
end
it. I don't see that. There's too much. I hate to use the term. I remember the major lobbyist for NATO in 1997 was a guy who worked for Northrop Grumman. But you got the interoperability problem that the NATO forces have to have some measure of being able to coordinate. So it's going to take a while, but the general thrust being put through now is we have to use funding that might go to social services. Well, the pension reform. We were in the Parliament the day in London when they began debate on disability cuts. They've already cut heating for elderly people. This is the Labor project. They did some increase in minimum wage, but they're banking on growth. So you can imagine looking at this tariffs policy, but no one's going to cut and run right in that way. It's not a war zone. It's not as if what we did in Afghanistan or Vietnam.
Part of the reason I want to talk a little bit from the European perspective, it feels like part of the reason this is happening the way it's happening, which is in a blind panic, basically. Like, we don't know, the United States could bug out tomorrow. We have to be ready. We have to, flood plug hundreds of billions of euros into defense like yesterday. It's being done in a very, it seems like, frightened, white-knuckling kind of way. And I think part of the reason for that, it can be laid at the feet, or the blame for that can be laid at the feet of European leaders who lived through the first Trump term, lived through all of his rhetoric about Europe and NATO and the defense burden and, the uncertainty about what he was going to do, and thought, you started to see some, like, we have to be planning for a post-United States Europe. And then 2020 happened. Joe Biden comes in, and it was like, we're all fine again. Everybody's fine. We can just go back to the way things were, and we don't have to worry about
Not only fine, really good. Yeah, I agree. Because he was, in essence, a traditional Cold Warrior. He was a person of that generation. He really believed. And I think he was pushed, but he moved the Ukraine-Russia policy to a place it didn't need to be, because he was pushed. And you could see this. This is where there's old-fashioned reporting. Last Sunday, the Times had 10,000 words on the partnership between the United States and Ukraine, the intimate involvement of U.S. intelligence and weaponry and
extremely intimate. Yeah,
it was even for those of us who follow it, it was kind of mind-boggling how intimate the relationship was. I do think memory is important. Europe is a place which, responsibility of memory. But I can remember when NATO, there was real serious opposition to the expansion of NATO by George Kennan, the diplomat, Senator Bradley, all these mainstream figures. We lost that battle as it expanded under George W. But Trump is a businessman, and he probably inspired a lot of this defense buildup because he wanted the budgets, right? The GDP had to be 5%, and he's a businessman. He didn't want to be ripped off. He doesn't understand. But NATO is supremely, it's not a coffee clutch. It's not the AARP. It's a military organization. So kind of commonsensically, those who are idiots and who remember history, when the Warsaw Pact folded, maybe NATO, its counterpart, might have folded, but no, it found new energy. And I remember Walter Mosley is one of our editorial board members, and he said he was going to Comic-Con. I said, Walter, didn't that economic group fold after the Cold War? He said, Katrina, you need a life. He said he was going to San Diego to Comic-Con. But more seriously, I remember Gorbachev talking about a common European home from Vladivostok to Lisbon. And the demilitarization of Europe was not a pipe dream. The EU could be a stronger organization, the OSCE, the OECD, but NATO is privileged now because it's a military organization. The one key thing in the negotiations with Russia, which are not going that well, because I think Trump overplays his ability to close a deal, but is not NATO membership for Ukraine. NATO doesn't even qualify right now if you looked at the articles of the NATO charter, but I don't think there's much push on NATO right now. NATO joining NATO. EU is part of the negotiation.
Yeah, I think the talk is, how do you do a security guarantee point that isn't NATO membership, but still means
security, like,
if we cede this territory, de facto or fully legally to Russia, are we not just going to be back here 6 months from now? Which is an understandable concern from the Ukrainian perspective.
You need tough security guarantees.
To sort of get back to my point about like European leaders just having the most kind of myopic short-term outlook on things. Like the fact that we're here at this point, having again experienced Trump already once for 4 years, and they can't conceive of putting together a deterrent force to put in Ukraine without being dependent on the United States for air support or for air defense systems. Like, it's just mind-boggling to me that this hasn't been done in a more gradual way to kind of ramp up the capabilities in the event that, if Trump came back or somebody else talked about the United States kind of pulling back from Europe.
Very, very briefly, but what is going to decide Ukraine's future is the reconstruction. Because it can go in different ways. It can be a people's reconstruction with funding, can be led by people of Ukraine, or you're going to get Blackstone, BlackRock, and all these corporations have already come in to check out the resources. You have the story yesterday or today about the environmental cost of the war. And there has to be funding. There was a czar for reconstruction in the Biden administration, Penny Pritzker. Remember, she was Commerce Secretary under Obama. So I'm just saying how Ukraine is rebuilt will be very important because it's been blasted. And Russia should play a role. There should be like an oligarchical fund devoted to rebuilding parts of a country that the oligarchs before the war and probably after will ravage.
So just as kind of a final thought or final question here, what do you think should be the future of this globe-spanning empire? I'm looking out the next 10, 20, 30 years. I think that the major goal to quote-unquote pivot to Asia and challenge Chinese regional hegemony is essentially a fantasy. The United States just isn't going to be able to do it. So that's left with the United States having significant influence in the Middle East, obviously in the Western Hemisphere, and Europe. Obviously, the country has done an enormous amount of damage to the Middle East. We don't have to go into the details there. One could argue something similar for Latin America. But where does this empire go from here in this moment of transition? The first real moment of transition in terms of declining power in well over a century.
So I'm a member of the Quincy Institute, which was started by Andrew Bacevich, who is, I think,
so am I.
We got
and my wife works for it. My wife is an employee of Quincy.
I think Quincy is an important contribution to this time. It's 5 years old. It's competing with well-funded and other organizations, but it's at least a break on the kind of imperial thinking that has dominated Washington. And I think, the nation founded in 1865, if there's a through line, because we kind of messed it up on some things during that 160 years, is that empire isn't the best way to achieve real democracy, and that we do better focusing on our democracy, becoming a beacon of light and humility, and not live with triumphalism, which I think is part of why we have a new Cold War, the triumphalism of the post-Cold War into a new Cold War. I think it's very difficult for countries to go through decline. I wouldn't call it decline. When people say decline, it's a more measured, it's a more, you find ways to explain to people and not be arrogant about, well, we know better because we're experts. So I think it's an interesting time. I can't speak optimistically, but I do think that the break in imperial thinking is coming or has come. I I go back to Munich. By the way, Munich was started the conference, which has become a place of turmoil. It was started as a military gathering, I think, where generals would come together and military sellers. But, in 2007, I believe, Putin gave a speech which announced the end. It was that we are a multipolar world. And it was because of the crisis of Iraq that, we kind of had to think that way. We weren't the empire saving everyone. We were rampaging. So I think that the Quincy Institute thinking, I think everyone should read Andrew Bacevich. I think people should listen to your podcast and read The Nation. And you'd get a sense of why empire has brought us more, less security. And I think more security is what people seek in the end. Everyone, has bigger ideas about what it could look like security, but that's what we're contesting in many ways.
So to bring it back to the domestic front, one of the things that I think is become more apparent than ever over the last couple of months under Trump is that while the empire may be winding down elsewhere around the world, the imperial presidency is still extraordinarily powerful, and it's turning its focus on domestic politics. When you have an administration that ignores court orders, that sends people to Salvadoran prisons who it even admits it did, in at least one case, in an administrative error, and the court says, okay, well, you got to get that guy back. And the response is, no, screw you. We're not going to do that. Like it feels like all of the power that we've loaded into this office in the name of empire over the last, 80 years is now being turned fully on the domestic front. And there's nothing to check what Trump is doing, at least not until he, loses control of the House, let's say in 2026. What do we do with that? Like, what do we do with that office to try and rectify that? Because it's not just about Trump. It's going to be about everybody who comes after him, who has this precedent to go on.
We've been warned. We've had think of Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the imperial presidency. The accretion of power in that office has continued without enough check, except there's some very good organizations and push has been made to reduce the power. But I think what you just said should be on everyone's mind and everywhere about the dangers, the extreme danger of giving executive offices so much power. And what we face now is there's no check. The Supreme Court is bought in with some of its decisions before he was reelected. And I think that needs to be on everyone's mind because it becomes personality driven. We didn't pay that much attention when there was a president we kind of could work with. But this is extreme. And I think if it doesn't wake up people now, it never, ever will. But I agree with you. The cruelty, too, is one. I mean, we haven't talked about the cruelty, the punching down, the bullying that is embedded in some of these decisions. I mean, the other day they closed, the attention to detail is horrifying. They closed a small office that was giving poor children extra meals. I mean, I guess the hatred of government and budgets or like deficits has so driven people berserk. We're literally, I mean, you agreed when I said rolling back the 20th century, we're literally at a place where Social Security and Medicare are two policies that, people really feel are in their lives and don't want disaggregate, but then remember the famous get your hands off government's hands off my Medicare. There's almost a sense that it's a right given, not necessarily by government. But I do think there is, and it's cliche to say at the root, a hatred of government. So you have people who hate government running it, so it's made even less efficient, worthy. And people who hate deficits because that they grow up with. That is like your family budget, right? Which is so crazy. People sitting around a table and looking at their bills. Yeah, but you do invest in someone going to school. You do invest.
It's a win-win, really. Like, sorry. Yeah.
You could do you could do days of podcasts inviting people on who've written about executive power, who've warned about executive power, who haven't been listened to, or poo-pooed, like that's not, in fact, on the nuclear angle, and that's kind of been normalized. You got generals on TV talking about, we might use a tactical nuclear weapon in the field. There's been a lot of activity about, do you have a check on the president as the sole figure who can hit the button?
Not really. That's not a good answer, but no, not really. But I think to your point about the meanness, like the nastiness of it, it's sort of a win-win for a lot of these guys. Their hatred of government is such that, if you close down the office that gives poor kids extra meals and people get mad at the government for closing down the office, that's a win. We've won. People hate the government a little bit more. We've made it a little coarser and a little nastier. So it really is like it's a no-lose thing for them.
But, there are the federal workers losing their jobs, the park range. I mean, you got a whole passel of people who are government. I think it was Marjorie Taylor Greene or someone who's in the government was on one of the Sunday shows and said, the government, it's so corrupt, it's so mean, it's horrible. And the interviewer said, but you are the government. You are in the government. She was like, oh, right. I'm Homeland Security or something.
Jesus Christ. we are truly doomed. On that note, Katrina, really, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. We really appreciate it. Yeah, and I'd love to have you back again. Thank you.
Terrific. Have a good day. Don't think too much about empire, but do.
We always do.
I'm sure you do. Take care. Bye.
You're listening to American Prestige. To listen, and
like worry on a wrong nut busted.
That's competition. We swamp and deny.
Hello, Prestige heads, and welcome to American Prestige. I'm Danny Bessner, here as always with my friend and comrade, Derek Davison, and we come to you the day after Liberation Day. Derek and I are hooting, we are hollering, and we're just so excited for where this country is headed, clearly in a positive
we're liberated.
direction.
I mean, I think that's the bottom line, is we're liberated.
As liberated peoples. So let's bring you the news. Starting off in the land of liberation, Derek, tell us about this risk of a U.S.-Iran conflict.
Yes, we may be liberating Iranians from the burden of having a functioning country, I guess. There's been a lot of chatter of late, and I felt like we should talk about it here, about the possibility of a U.S. military escalation vis-a-vis Iran. And to just recap where we are, Donald Trump, several weeks ago, sent Iran a letter, sent the Iranian government, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, a letter asking him to consider negotiations over a new nuclear deal. You may recall Donald Trump tore up the last nuclear deal in 2018 during his first term. He wants to do another nuclear deal that I guess he would consider better than the one that Barack Obama negotiated. It would probably not be objectively better, but he would think of it that way because he did it. So he wants new negotiations. The Iranians have responded to that somewhat coolly. They've noted, understandably, that they don't feel like they can trust anything that Donald Trump agrees to, because, of course, or anything the United States agrees to, I guess, because of what happened in 2018. But they have offered the possibility of indirect negotiations. But in the meantime, Trump is, of course, bombing. He's restarted the America's eternal war on Yemen, the Houthis. He's threatening Iran and the Houthis on a regular basis. He openly on Sunday threatened to bomb Iran if the nuclear deal doesn't come about, which supposedly in the letter that he sent to Khamenei, he gave Khamenei a 2-month timeline to get a deal done. Nobody knows when that timeline is supposed to have started, or if it's even started, or what it's pegged to. But he did have this sort of deadline beyond which, I guess, military action would be conceivable. His comments on Sunday, where, as I say, he just openly threatened to bomb Iran if he doesn't get a deal, drew a number of sharp responses from Iranian officials. There was an IRGC commander, the commander in their aerospace division, Amir Ali Hajizadeh, who basically threatened U.S. soldiers who are stationed in the Middle East. He said they're sitting in a glass house, which seems like a pretty easy threat to parse. Ali Larijani, who's the former parliament speaker of Iran and current senior advisor to Khamenei, said in a TV interview on Monday that basically if the United States or Israel were to attack Iran's nuclear facilities on the basis of what he called the nuclear pretext, that would drive Iran to actually develop a nuclear bomb, that this would be, the point of no return for that. So all of these things kind of rhetorically are not necessarily in a great place. Beyond that, you have the fact that the U.S. military has deployed now a second aircraft carrier to the region. It's deployed the USS Carl S. Vinson and its carrier group, which had been in kind of Asia Pacific, sent it to the Middle East. It's joining, when it gets there, it will join the Harry S. Truman and its carrier group, whose stay deployment in the Middle East region has been extended. So that gives the U.S. 2 carrier groups in the region. The U.S. military has also put at least half a dozen B-2 stealth bombers on Diego Garcia, which I think we may talk about later in another context. But that puts them well within range of striking Iran. Both of these things, I guess you could say, are related to the eternal war in Yemen, but that seems like a lot of firepower for the Houthis. No offense to them. So, there's speculation that Trump is marshaling resources in advance of some kind of military strike against the Iranians. Looming, I guess, in the background of all this, I mentioned the nuclear deal that Trump tore up in 2018. The tattered remnants of that deal, which was, of course, negotiated in 2015, includes other countries besides the United States and the United Nations. The tattered remnants of that deal are scheduled to sunset officially in October, and that basically means UN sanctions on Iran over its nuclear program that were suspended under the terms of the nuclear deal will be reimposed effectively, because there's been no long-term resolution to the issue, or could be reimposed at least. This is all serious enough that the French government, Emmanuel Macron, called a meeting on Wednesday to discuss the possibility of a military confrontation between the U.S. And Iran, including his security cabinet, a number of experts. I don't know who that entails. The French Foreign Minister, Jean-Noël Barrot, told reporters after that meeting that a military confrontation is, quoting him here, almost inevitable unless there is some sort of new nuclear agreement. So we're in a very precarious position. Trump, according to Axios, is seriously considering the Iranians' offer of indirect negotiations, which I think Laura Rosen at her diplomatic newsletter has said the Iranians view as sort of a starting point, that you could open with these indirect talks. And if they go well, then you could maybe move to some sort of direct negotiation where some things could, more substantive things could actually get done. Of course, Donald Trump changes his mind on a whim. So if he wakes up tomorrow and has a bad morning, then who knows what he could do. His administration internally is divided between people who want to make a show of negotiating to try and get a deal before they start bombing, and the people who just want to start bombing now. So there's a little bit of paralysis perhaps within the administration. And, again, Trump being as mercurial as he is, who knows? But he's, for right now, reportedly favors the idea of negotiations over the idea of just going straight to the conflict. But I don't think that's a strong preference.
Whenever the U.S. thinks it's out of the Middle East, they get pulled back in, Derek. They're never going to make this strategic transition, man. We've been talking about it for almost 15 years at this point. Yeah. They're just never going to be able to do it. They can't leave. Speaking of the region, let's talk about the Israeli government's rejection of another Gaza ceasefire and what the military is planning to do in terms of carving up the territory.
Over the weekend, Khalil al-Hayya, who's one of several senior Hamas political officials now, after the death of Yahya Sinwar, they've sort of diversified their leadership a bit. But Hayya is certainly in a position to speak for the organization. Over the weekend, he said that they had accepted a ceasefire proposal that had been put forth by Egypt and Qatar, that would have seen a 50-day truce. Hamas would have released 5 living captives over that period of time. And ostensibly during that 50 days, the Israelis and Hamas would have gotten down to actually negotiating the second phase, at this point pretty basically mythical second phase of the January ceasefire deal that's supposed to see a full cessation of hostilities, Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, et cetera, et cetera. The Israeli government immediately rejected it and proposed its own formula, the terms of which I don't even think are relevant at this point, because they don't want to negotiate a deal. This is the point. Like, this is whack-a-mole. If Hamas accepted to the letter every detail of Israel's counter proposal, the Israelis would probably find something wrong with that and say, no, we don't want that. We want something else. And we just could play this game over and over again. What they really are doing, and this gets into what they're doing inside the territory, is they're trying to implement Donald Trump's turn Gaza into the Riviera of the Eastern Mediterranean without any Palestinian population left in it, that plan. And so what's going on now is the IDF, the Israeli military, has been ordered to seize larger and larger chunks of territory within Gaza, piecemeal. They're building on these security zones, or so-called security zones, that they've created on the outskirts of Gaza and on the Netzarim corridor in the middle of Gaza, to sort of expand those outward and continue emptying out territory, forcing more and more people into the one single strip of land along the coast, the Mawasi so-called safe zone. It's not really safe. The Israelis keep bombing it, but this is the one place where people are allowed to relocate. They're seizing territory in Rafah. They're seizing, parts of Khan Yunis, all over the place. They're doing this. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, announced on Wednesday that he's ordered the IDF to open a new security corridor in addition to Netzarim and the Philadelphia corridor, which lies along the Egyptian border. This one's called the Morag corridor. It's situated, it's named after a former Israeli settlement that was positioned between Rafah and Khan Yunis in the southern part of Gaza. And so it looks like the parameters are not exactly understood, and Netanyahu didn't go into a lot of detail, but it sounds like what they're going to do is to cut Rafah off basically from the rest of Gaza with this new security corridor. And, I guess, at that point, just empty it completely out of people, send them all to Mawasi, or, tell them to go to Mawasi, and then anybody who doesn't go will be ipso facto deemed an enemy combatant and eligible to be killed. So yeah, it's systematically driving the population into a very tiny area, a concentrated area, if you will, from which they could probably be involuntarily, or I'm sure we'd call it voluntary, but they could be moved out, at the Israeli government's discretion, if it decides to go full bore for the Trump plan and just ethnically cleanse the territory.
Thank you, Derek. Let's talk about the IDF, which has resumed the bombing of Beirut.
It's carried out a couple of strikes on southern Beirut over the last, let's say, week or so. I guess the last several days. This is a new escalation. I mean, the Israelis haven't really ever maintained the November ceasefire with Hezbollah, but they had at least restricted their airstrikes to southern Lebanon, to eastern Lebanon. They had not returned to Beirut, but of course the Dahia neighborhood in southern Beirut is Hezbollah's official headquarters. And so the Israelis have finally now, a couple of times over the past week, struck targets in Dahia. They killed at least 4 people on Tuesday morning trying to kill, and I guess apparently they did kill a Hezbollah official who was involved with the organization's Palestinian file, as the Israelis put it. These are obvious, violations of the ceasefire. They're obvious violations of Lebanese sovereignty. Both the new prime minister of Lebanon, Nawaf Salam, and the new president of Lebanon, Joseph Aoun, have commented that these are breaches of the ceasefire. These are violations of sovereignty. They've sort of been pleading with the international community, i.e. the United States, to do something to rein the Israelis in, to no avail, because the international community, or really the United States, if we want to be specific about it, doesn't recognize any sort of Lebanese sovereignty, and neither does the Israeli government. So that hasn't gone anywhere. But this is definitely, I think, a point where if Hezbollah is going to itself decide that the November ceasefire is no longer applicable, and that it needs, for whatever reason, to re-engage in conflict with the Israelis, this resumption of airstrikes on Beirut is going to be the thing that does it.
Thanks, Derek. Let's talk about the Myanmar earthquake and the responses to it. So, yeah, I'm sure people have seen really horrifying videos from this, but what has been happening since the earthquake?
Yeah, it's been fairly nightmarish. A 7.7 magnitude earthquake struck near the Myanmar city of Mandalay on Friday. The death toll, just I think on Thursday, the official death toll climbed above 3,000. It may go higher. I don't know how much higher. The last details I saw prior to the updated number on Thursday were that there were about 27 to 2,800 people dead and another 400 or so missing. I don't know if the government has a good handle on really how many people are missing, given how remote some of the places that were hit by this earthquake are, and given just the state of Myanmar being, with big swaths of it under rebel control rather than government control. I'm not sure anybody has a great handle on this, as they're keeping track of the toll that this earthquake has taken. The earthquake was widespread enough that it was felt, in Bangkok and all across the region. I think there was an under construction skyscraper in Bangkok that came down. That's like 800 miles away from the epicenter of this earthquake, but that under construction skyscraper was brought down by the force of this thing. It was just huge. It was not both the magnitude and I guess it was very shallow in the Earth's crust, which makes the tremors, the effects, more severe. You mentioned the response. It's been haphazard, as you might expect. There have been accusations that Myanmar's ruling junta is basically denying aid groups and aid, material from reaching parts of the country that are under rebel control or are contested. It had not until Wednesday. It took all the way until Wednesday, 5 days before the junta even announced a ceasefire, which it's imposing until April 22nd in its conflicts against Myanmar's various rebel groups. Several rebel groups had already announced their own ceasefires by that point. So, for 5 days, basically, as, people were being pulled out, or bodies were being pulled out of rubble, and, rescue work and recovery work was going on, the junta was still bombing villages that are under rebel control. It's just kind of a ghastly thing to conceive, but that's what was going on. As I say, it did impose a ceasefire on Wednesday, but the difficulty of relief efforts under the circumstances, given the fragmentation in Myanmar and the challenges in reaching some of the really remote kind of rural areas, make this very difficult. And of course, Donald Trump on Friday pledged U.S. support for the recovery effort. I don't think there's going to be any, because, of course, he has destroyed the agency, USAID, that would have handled that. And there's really nothing in place at this point to replace it. So I don't know how much assistance they're going to get from the U.S. They've gotten a fair amount from China, from Russia, from other countries in the region. But I think things are still in a very dangerous situation right now.
Let's talk about South Korea, where the Yoon ruling is set for Friday, or the day that you, dear listeners, are listening to this.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention this because people will be hearing it when people listen to this, the ruling will probably already be out. The South Korean Constitutional Court announced earlier this week that it will finally issue its ruling on Yoon Suk-yeol's impeachment on Friday. 6 of the court's 8 justices have to uphold the impeachment for Yoon to be removed from office. And if that happens, it will trigger a snap election for president that has to be held within 60 days. If the court overturns the impeachment, we will have the ridiculous situation of a president who tried to do a self coup and then failed hours later and was impeached for it, returning to full-time duty in office. I don't know how he could possibly do that. It would seem to me he's going to be completely compromised on the job, but that is a possibility, I guess, that he could wind up staying in office somehow, and we'd have to see how that goes. I don't think it would be a very smooth process, but it is something to consider.
That'd be wild.
That would be pretty wild.
That would be pretty fucking wild. Let's talk about the Sudanese military, which has secured Khartoum.
The military, we talked about this last week, but it finally, on Friday, declared victory in its battle to retake Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, from the Rapid Support Forces militant group. It apparently was able, after having taken over the airport, the Republican Palace, the central bank, like a lot of the official buildings in central Khartoum, was apparently able to take out or seize the Rapid Support Forces' main base or remaining foothold in the Jebel Aulia area, which is, I think, in the southern part of the city, and issued a statement, sort of trumpeting its seizure of what it called the last pockets of the remnants of the Dagalo terrorist militia. Of course, the RSF is led by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo. It's sort of a milestone in the conflict. I think it means a full shifting of resources and attention probably to Darfur and the Kordofan region, both of which the RSF has a much stronger position, especially in Darfur, where it is still besieging the city of Al Fasher in North Darfur state, but most of the rest of the populated areas, at least, of Darfur, the heavily populated areas, are under RSF control. So that's probably where most of the effort is going to shift, assuming that the Sudanese military wants to retake those parts of the country and isn't going to just settle into a de facto partition, which is also, I guess, another possibility. We'll just have to see what happens next.
Thanks, Derek. Let's talk about the African Union, which has sent a mediation team to South Sudan.
Yeah, we've been talking about South Sudan for a few weeks now. The breakdown in the relationship between President Salva Kiir and Vice President Riek Machar, the former rivals, once again rivals apparently, as Machar has been placed under house arrest. A number of people from his Sudan People's Liberation Movement and opposition party have been expunged from the government. There are conflicts between South Sudanese security forces and SPLM-IO cadres in various parts of the country. There have been conflicts between South Sudanese forces and the so-called White Army in Upper Nile State, which is probably connected or maybe connected to Machar in some way, or Machar has, I think, claimed a connection in the past. It's not entirely clear how strong it is, but this country is on the verge of a resumption of the civil war that supposedly ended in 2018 when Kiir and Machar signed a peace agreement that has never been fully implemented, but still kind of, has been keeping the brakes on any return to conflict. The African Union did send a mediating mission to Juba on Wednesday to try to prevent a slide back into full-blown civil war. I don't know how that mission has gone as yet. There was an earlier mission this week. Raila Odinga, the former Prime Minister of Kenya, was sent on behalf of the Regional Intergovernmental Authority on Development bloc. He didn't seem to meet with much success. He met with Kiir, but he was denied permission to speak to Machar, who is in custody. And I think his mission kind of fizzled out as a result of that. The African Union had previously called for Machar to be released after his arrest. So I'm not sure they're going to get any better reception from Kiir and his government. But this is we're at the stage of I guess regional organizations trying to throw together whatever they can to prevent a resumption of war.
Let's talk about this United Kingdom Mauritius deal on the Chagos archipelago, which has just received U.S. approval.
They are close to a final agreement, apparently, on this. The Chagos Islands, which the UK retained control of when it gave independence to Mauritius, in the mid 20th century. The Mauritian government has been trying to get control of the Chagos Islands back from the UK, or what it says is back. There's some disagreement with the Chagosians whether they were ever really supposed to be, were they were ever really part of Mauritius, or they should be independent. But the upshot is the Mauritian government has been trying to get these islands from the UK for a long time now, and there was a deal reached, a draft agreement that was reached last year in November. But was held up partly because of the forthcoming, or the deal was reached in October, rather. The election, there was a Mauritian election in November that kind of held things up. And there's been a lot of criticism in both UK and US circles. The US is involved here because the largest of the Chagos Islands is Diego Garcia, which is where the US military has maybe its most important strategically important overseas military base, or one of a handful that are vitally strategically important, or at least the U.S. military regards them as such. And so there's been concern about what could happen here. The UK leases that base to the United States, or I'm not sure it's a lease, with just kind of the goodness of their hearts, has given that base to the US for its use. There was some concern about what could happen to Diego Garcia, but the terms of the agreement that apparently is now in its final stages of being negotiated would have the Chagos being turned over to Mauritian control, but Diego Garcia, Mauritius would then turn around and lease that island to the UK for at least the next 99 years. So, good news, I guess. I know you were worried about the base, Danny. It looks like
Haven't been able to sleep, Derek.
Be safe.
Haven't been able to sleep.
Another century. Yeah.
Thank the Lord. Okay, let's turn to a big one. Russia, Ukraine, and Trump is, as we call in the internet business, big mad at both Putin and Zelensky.
Yeah, this is over the weekend. We got a whole array of stories. Somebody at the White House was doing some broad leaking to various media outlets about how Donald Trump was reportedly, and I'm going to quote from Al Jazeera here, angry and pissed off at Russian President Vladimir Putin. This was after Putin on Friday gave another one of these musing kind of snarky responses to a question about negotiating peace deal with Ukraine, where he questioned Volodymyr Zelensky's legitimacy, given that Zelensky, under martial law, which is the appropriate thing to do under Ukrainian law, canceled last year's presidential election. Putin has maintained for some time now that this makes Zelensky an illegitimate dictator and that he can't possibly negotiate a peace deal. I mean, his concern for the rule of law in the country that he invaded is touching. He's insisted that he can't negotiate with Zelensky, and Zelensky wouldn't be able to sign legitimately a peace deal. So on Friday, he renewed this objection and kind of wondered whether there could be like a UN administration installed on a temporary basis that could negotiate, or something else. What other arrangements the international community could come up with to get around this horrible issue that Volodymyr Zelensky is not legitimately the president of Ukraine anymore. Trump got pissed off about this, which seems a little odd because Donald Trump has said the same thing about Zelensky after the Oval Office spat that they had. Trump referred to him as a dictator over the same exact issue because he canceled last year's presidential election. So I don't know. This is all, how Donald Trump's beautiful mind works. I try not to think about it very much. But he is mad at Putin telling people that he's frustrated, that Russia has kind of slow rolled ceasefire negotiations, which is the first step toward a peace deal. I guess if he gets mad enough, if he gets big enough mad, this could turn into new sanctions on Russia, but I'm not sure that we're at that point yet. He is also, though, as it should be noted, he's also losing patience with Zelensky. And this is over the mineral rights deal, which continues to kind of roil this relationship. I think we talked last week about the Trump administration offering a new minerals deal after the old one kind of got blown up again during the Oval Office argument. That a little embarrassing episode. The new minerals deal that the U.S. is offering is even more exploitative than the previous one. It takes a bigger chunk of the Ukrainian economy as compensation for the supposed loans or of support that the U.S. has been giving to Ukraine, which Zelensky does not regard as loans, and were probably not pitched to him as loans by the Biden administration, but that's how Trump regards them. Zelensky has basically been very frosty, very cool about this deal. He said, we're studying it. It seems a little bit over the top. We're not entirely sure we can agree to it as it's written. And Trump told reporters on Sunday that Zelensky, he said, is trying to back out of the rare earth deal. And if he does that, he's got some big problems. So Trump, as I say, not terribly thrilled with either of these guys at this point. They're not bending to his will, I guess.
As you all know, my favorite national holiday is spring break. And the travel dollar to sure well as so plus fee 60 those code. Let's talk about El Salvador and the cover up there.
This was reported by DropSite several days ago, Sunday, I believe, that basically there's an element to the deal that the Trump administration reached with Nayib Bukele on which allowed the U.S. to expel basically a bunch of not just Salvadorans, but Venezuelan alleged gang members. They weren't given any due process, so how do we know? But that, of course, expelled hundreds of people to El Salvador to be shunted into Bukele's massive counterterrorism prison. A few weeks ago, part of the deal, according to DropSite, was that the Trump administration agreed to return a man, a figure from the MS-13 gang, a man named Cesar Humberto Lopez Larios, or a.k.a. Greñas. And according to DropSite, this guy is high up enough in MS-13 that he has knowledge of some embarrassing interactions between MS-13 and Bukele's government. Bukele has denied steadfastly for his entire presidency that he has been negotiating with MS-13 on what it amounts to an agreement to kind of take it easy on MS-13 as long as they lower the level of gang violence and give him a political win in that sense. And Bukele has rejected this. He's rejected it as basically slander, as untrue. But apparently, this guy has knowledge that these negotiations have been going on, and Bukele was very keen to get him out of the U.S. before U.S. prosecutors had a chance to talk to him and potentially reveal that these negotiations have been going on. And so the Trump administration obliged, as part of the arrangement that opened up the opportunity to expel all these people to El Salvador, obliged him by sending this guy in the group of 238, I think it was, or 250 some people to El Salvador to further the cover up, basically to maintain it for him.
And what about this apology?
This is really awful. So we know that of all the people who were sent back to El Salvador, none of them basically were given, very few of them at least, were given due process. There's no proof in many cases that these people were part of any gang, whether it's MS-13 or Tren de Agua or any other kind of criminal organization. But the administration has openly admitted now that at least one of these people was shipped back due to what it called an administrative error. A man named Kilmer Abrego Garcia, and it was apparently classified as being a member of MS-13, but there was no evidence of that. It's never been proven. He's never been convicted of a crime related to being an MS-13. The Immigrations and Customs Enforcement Agency did say that they carried out his removal in good faith, so I guess we got to give them that. But he has been shunted into this, hellhole, this massive prison in El Salvador for apparently no good reason. Even as I say, the administration says this was a mistake and he shouldn't have been sent there. But it also says that it has no legal authority to get him out of the Salvadoran prison. It had no legal authority to send him in the first place, but that's, I guess, water under the bridge. And this is really just like terrifying shit. I mean, this guy's life is ruined. He's stuck in a Salvadoran prison, without any recourse, I guess, or at least no recourse that the Trump administration is willing to engage in to try and get him out. It's just sort of saying, oopsie, sorry about that, but there's nothing we can do about it now.
Derek, our beautiful National Security Council has been shaped by friend of the pod, Laura Loomer. What is going on?
I don't really know. This is from there was a story in Axios. I think The Guardian has it as well. That Laura Loomer, the hanger-on who has some kind of relationship with Trump, I don't really know. But she visited the White House, I guess, on Wednesday and brought with her a list of people on the National Security Council who she wants fired. Ostensibly because they're neocons, and the Trump administration is trying to purge neocons. At least in theory, it's got a bunch of them working for him. His Secretary of State, for example. But I digress. But she's very mad that there's all these neocons on the National Security Council, and so she gave Trump this list of people who should be fired. As it happens, the Trump administration is on Thursday firing a bunch of people from the National Security Council. And I don't think anybody has established a direct link between the list that Laura Loomer supposedly gave Trump and these firings. But the coincidence is pretty hard to miss. So, I don't have details really here, or much of any information about who exactly is being fired or what their backgrounds are, but it is just another day in paradise, I guess, for people living under the Trump administration.
And let's end on the big news of the week, which is, of course, these tariffs.
Yes, as you noted earlier, Wednesday was Liberation Day. We're all liberated from a lot of money or the need to buy any consumer goods that don't cost a lot more money than they should, because Donald Trump has imposed a really, I think, exceeding in some cases, like people's worst case expectations, has imposed a massive array of new tariffs on virtually, nearly every country. The only countries that got away without, I think, North Korea, which doesn't, of course, export anything to the United States, Russia, which is already under heavy sanctions still because of Ukraine, Mexico and Canada have their own tariff dealings with the Trump administration. But for the most part, just about everybody else is getting hit with at least a baseline 10% tariff on imported goods on pretty much, it seems like everything. The details are still being worked out, I think, but the initial analysis was that there's going to be a 10% tariff on pretty much everything coming into the United States now. But there's another group. There's a special group of countries, around 60 countries, that the administration singled out for being particularly unfair in their trade practices, and some of them are absurd, like Lesotho, which has one of the tiniest economies in the world, Several Australian islands, including a couple where I don't think there are any people living on them, got singled out for higher tariffs. I don't totally understand how that works, but the numbers are shocking. There are tariffs on an additional 34% tariff on products coming from China, which was already at, I think, 20% across the board, and in some areas even higher than that. 46% tariff on goods coming from Vietnam, 49% on Cambodia. Like, these are some of the higher end ones, but 20% on goods coming from the European Union. So just a huge kind of a lot of carnage on the free trade front, I guess, is where we're at. And the effects are already being felt on the stock market. I don't know if anybody cares that much about this, but the stocks are not doing well today. They're down quite a bit.
The stocks aren't doing well, Derek.
There's been a little bit of a stock ball. They're down quite a bit. The Dow's down, I think, 3%, and NASDAQ and all these, I don't know, all the different things, but they're not doing great is the point.
It's times like
people
these,
are still
Derek.
People are still assessing this. I don't have much more to say because I think a lot of the analysts who were watching this are sort of in shock today at the extent of what he announced, and still trying to figure out what the ramifications